Yeah, if you want to go to the first slide, we'll start with an absolutely classic definition of what it is.
Yes, it's on.
Okay, the first slide is a quote from Tim Wu. He is considered one of the sort of gurus of the internet. And if I can just read the important bits about it, it's essentially, and this is his definition, remember there are many definitions, it's that internet service providers and governments should treat all data, remember the internet is just the delivery of packets from one place to another, all data on the internet equally, not discriminating or charging differentially by user, content, site, platform, application, type of attached equipment or mode of communication. That really covers it all. But because there are many elements to what he says, I'll just go through, and Leanna, if I could have the next slide, please.
Yes. It's on.
Okay. What I want to point out on this slide is that there are many meanings to what we mean by difference and treating things equally. It could be the differential treatment of packets, a voice packet as opposed to a data packet or a BitTorrent packet for that matter. It could be between internet service providers for different types of content, where maybe it's video content or it's voice. Or it might be about charging. It might be what telephone, the actual infrastructure providers charge ISPs, what ISPs charge content providers, or it might even be based on, from an ISP, one ISP favoring itself over other ISPs. So when we look at Tim Wu's definition, we realize it can involve a lot of different ways, both in who can discriminate against whom or what, and on the basis. It might be a basis of the type of packet, on the actual content itself, or against different parties in the transaction. In all of them, in all of the definitions, what is generally implied, but most often not said, is they usually don't say, by the way, we're going to have normal traffic management. And what's meant by that is telecommunications networks are not designed for peak traffic. So they will cut back, throttle back, if you will, when the traffic is very heavy on their networks. And it's usually considered all right to do that as long as what you're doing is simply making sure that the network is not overloaded and that it continues to operate. So those are the elements. And what I'm going to do is talk about three different parties and the way they see what network neutrality means, and with that, we'll get a better idea of the way people look at it, and then go to the US example, which is the most contentious and the most recent. So, Liana, if I may have the next slide, please. Okay, the first is ArmSIG. We're all I'm a member of the chapter of Australia, and they have on their website a number of policy positions. One of them is on network neutrality, and this is the basic position they have, and these are the sorts of things that they will say in any statement about network neutrality. The challenges when you're talking about network neutrality for ArmSIG is basically, first of all, simply blocking or filtering. Is there discrimination such that some content is blocked, whether it's a type of content or a type of packet? Or filtering, and that filtering amounts oftentimes to simply censorship. Now, normally what ArmSIG does is talk about lawful content. It is not sanctioning measures that are designed to stop illegal content. But blocking and filtering is the first. Fast lanes is the next item, and what the term that's usually used is paid prioritization. That means that, for example, your phone provider might have a special deal with a football team. And if you're with that provider, then you're not charged for watching matches of that football team. It's the sort of thing that gives somebody an advantage either because they don't have to pay for a product or it's not counted against their download speeds. Throttling is a kind of the other reverse of the same thing, where the network will throttle back carrying certain content, not because they're managing traffic, but because in fact they're trying to stop different kinds of packets. Again, it's a network neutrality issue. Zero-rated services is another thing where, in fact, again, that's the kind of situation where a provider's done a deal with a content provider and you don't get charged or it doesn't count against your download speeds to watch the particular content that your provider has made a deal with. And finally, market competition. By that, it's meant, does the telephone provider charge differentially between other providers and itself, or as against all ISPs or some ISPs? Usually that's dealt with simply by anti-competitive legislation, but sometimes that's included in network neutrality. Next slide, please, Liana. Okay. The principles of ISOC reflect the sorts of difficulties that they identified. They are for openness and for access to all content. That's about the content and about the filtering as well. And transparency, who's doing what kind of services do they carry, and what are the terms and conditions. Users should have control over what they see. And in the end, and this is again that sort of anti-competitive notion, there should be fair and impartial access to internet resources and any kind of transparency which should be required so that access, terms and conditions are known by all of the providers, whether that's the telcos, the ISPs, or indeed customers. Okay, next slide, please. So that's ISOC's position. The EU has come up with a very detailed statement, a directive is what they call it, on network neutrality. And it's dated 2015, and I'm going to have to put my glasses on, okay? The premises for it, first of all, users will be free to access content. So again, you get that kind of stress on content and non-discrimination of content. Paid prioritization. That's again the situation where some content is favored over others through usually anti-competitive means. The treatment of traffic equally. Again, though, there are public interest exceptions. That's usually what's lawful content. But as well, that's also the sorts of measures that may be taken to control traffic as well. And notice they use the term specifically, network management. And finally, there is provision for internet access providers to offer specialized services. It's a recognition that, in fact, there may be deals done to the extent that it's not at the expense of the open internet. In other words, traffic management that's normal is okay, but if you're actually favoring some providers over others, it's not okay. They also are very strong on content. So next slide, please. Okay. They're very strong on content. Everyone has the right to freedom of expression. It's the right to hold opinions, receive and impart information and ideas without interference. That goes along with their rule about content. And again, though, they will use the term lawful content because that's should not be seen as some kind of sanction for bad content. Okay, next slide, please. Talk about Australia. Australia does not have any rules about network neutrality per se. It's a complete opposite of the EU. And for example, Canada, up until a year ago, had much the same regime that we do. And that is the only discrimination that we worry about is if it's again from one packet sender to another or from one telco to a packet sender. So under competition law, you have to treat, if you are a telco provider or an ISP, you have to treat all packets the same. You can use network management techniques, but you have to treat all the same if you are even when you're managing traffic. We don't have anything specific about discrimination based on packet type. We don't have discrimination on price, although again, anti-competitive law would look at whether they're unfair charging or not. And we don't have discrimination by user, again, except if it's by by subscriber to a particular internet service provider. So the only rules that we really have that are specific are about discrimination by packet sender. The rest is implied, and so again, it's really absolutely contrary to the way EU has managed network neutrality. Okay, next slide, please. Network neutrality is perhaps the biggest, has the biggest coverage in the US, where it's a very hot issue right now. I have to give a bit of background. In the United States, under communications law, telecommunications providers are treated as common carriers. There's a concept of common carrier, whether it's a railway or a truck or whatever. But if you are carrying goods or services for the public, then there are specific rules for common carriers. And in the communications sphere, it's under the Communications Act 1934, Title II, and you'll see that term Title II a lot. But in the concept of common carrier, things like utilities, carriage of goods and services, have specific rules about non-discrimination. And in the communication sphere, that covers things like the telegraph, the telephone, and so forth. Historically, internet service providers, when the internet first started, were seen as simply information providers. They were not seen as providers of basic communications infrastructure, and so they were not regulated under the Federal Communications Commission. When President Obama, well, for probably several years, there were moves to say, well, actually the internet is used so often for communications that it ought to be brought under the control of the Federal Communications Commission, and it ought to be considered a carrier because that's the way a lot of people communicate. They communicate by Skype, they communicate by Zoom meetings, they communicate by Facebook, by WeChat, whatever. And for a long time, the courts kept knocking back the idea of internet service providers as common carriers. Under President Obama, the Open Internet Order of 2015, did two things. It once again tried to promulgate basic net neutrality rules, but it then argued the case why the internet service providers are common carriers. And in a landmark judgment, the courts finally said, we agree with your arguments. Internet service providers should be treated as common carriers, and therefore we uphold the Open Internet Order of 2015, which applies to ISPs. And so that is the concept of network neutrality. in the United States, and that's what the argument is about. There are three basic provisions in the Open Internet Order. The first is no blocking, and again that term, lawful content. So you cannot discriminate against content for any reason other than that it's simply unlawful. That applies to content, it applies to applications, it applies to devices. Again, there's reasonable network management that's allowed. No throttling, which would be to impair or degrade some communications over others. Again, this is not allowed, but again, network management is allowed. And finally, no paid prioritization, which would amount to favouring some traffic over others, including traffic shaping. But again, you can have network management practices. The thing to be noted here, though, is even though ISPs are treated as common carriers, they are not treated in the same way as basic telecommunications providers that provide the infrastructure. There are some additional requirements that are on telecommunications infrastructure providers that are not on ISPs. So it's sort of a Title II light, if you will. What has happened though with the change of government was there is a new FCC chair called Ajit Pai, and even before Obama was replaced by President Trump, Pai had said he did not approve of the categorization of internet service providers as Title II providers, and he would overturn it. Well, no sooner had President Trump got into office than Ajit Pai was named FCC chair, and sure enough, good as his word, he finally got his new consultation document. It's an ironic freedom. Quoting from him, the Commission has proposed a notice of proposed rulemaking to end the utility style, now that he means common carrier, utility style regulatory approach that gives government control of the internet. Well, no, it doesn't. And to restore the market-based policies necessary to preserve the future of the internet. We can argue about that, I'm not convinced. The one point he makes, but he doesn't make it very well, is to reverse the decline in infrastructure investment, innovation, and options for consumers. There is a slight argument there, and I'm happy to discuss that. But what has happened in the rulemaking that was issued, called Restoring Internet Freedom, and then I should have told you to go to the slides that has proposed rulemaking Restoring Internet Freedom. A second. Okay. He really is turning back the clock. He really wants to turn back the clock. He first wants to restore internet service providers back to being simply an internet information service. One of the aspects of the open internet, of Obama's open internet order, was that it covered mobile broadband internet. Obviously, since people communicate that way, that would also be reversed. And clearly, if the internet service providers are no longer considered as Title II common carriers, they would be back to being regulated by the Federal Trade Commission, not the FCC. And then to say if ex ante, that is, it means regulation before I would say the harm has been established, is necessary. And under Obama's order, there had been a basic conduct standard that was promulgated He wants to repeal that as well. So in fact, what the most recent order has done is simply turn back the clock to pre-Obama days. The comments were open for comment on July 12th. They will close on August 12th. And the next slide will show you in, I hope, bright red, the internet-wide day of action to save net neutrality. There has been a huge campaign in the States to stop what Pi is doing and to retain Obama's open internet order. I don't know if any of you have seen John Oliver. He is an American comedian with a late night show, and one of the passions of his life has been what he calls net neutrality, and you know that has its own definition in the United States. When the FCC tried to change network neutrality under Obama before, he managed to get 15 million people to write to the FCC and say no. Right now, five days into the public comment period on what Pi is wanting to do, which is his free the internet, they've had over 3 million submissions to the FCC. Almost all of them are opposing what Pi says. So that's where we're up to. Next slide, please. What I've done is a little chart. We don't have time to fill it in, but maybe you can, when thinking about what network neutrality is, these are the boxes you can fill in. And against each of the titles, you can think, what would I put, yes or no? And you would put different answers depending on different jurisdictions, which actually is my point, which is net neutrality means different things to different people in different countries. It means non-discrimination, but beyond that, as I've shown, it probably means different things depending on where you stand. And the next slide, please, Leanna. What I've also done is give you a list of the links so you can look up any of the material that I've referred to and fill in all of the blank spaces. And Leanna, next slide, please. Okay, are there any questions? Happy to take questions.
Do you have questions? No? Holly?
Yep.
Switch on to the Zoom now, so we can see you.
Okay.
So, I don't see any questions right now from our students.
Okay.
But, I think we will gather the questions if we have any, and send it to you.
Okay, all right. I'm happy to take any, if they've got any. Otherwise, they've got the links and they can actually follow through with the links.
Yes, that's a great idea.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I want to say thank you for being with us and